God's hidden financial plan for your immediate success. Florence Scovel Shinn taught that supply was never something you had to chase down or wrestle out of the world. It is something already prepared for you, waiting only for your own consciousness to line up and claim it. And if you have ever felt like the good things in life keep happening to everyone else, you are about to see why that feeling itself has been the obstacle. There is a verse tucked into the book of Isaiah, chapter 65, verse 24, and it reads like this: "Before they call, I will answer, and while they are yet speaking, I will hear." And when you sit with that for a moment, something in you goes quiet, because it means the plan was already finished before the need ever appeared. It means the supply was arranged before the bill ever arrived, before the fear ever arrived, before the doubt ever arrived. And Florence Scovel Shinn would stop you right there and say, "Do you see it? The answer is not something you have to earn or hunt down or manufacture through struggle. The answer is already spoken, already prepared, already waiting quietly on the other side of your asking. And what blocks it is never God's timing. What blocks it is your own conviction that you must strive and prove yourself worthy before the good can arrive. And that single belief, held often without even noticing it, is the hidden obstacle inside what looks like a hidden plan. Say it with me. I am open and receptive to God's abundant supply. My good comes to me now and in expected ways. My word is my wand. Again, I am open and receptive to God's abundant supply. My good comes to me now and in expected ways. My word is my wand. If something in you just went quiet as you heard that, you are not alone. So many of you carry a private exhaustion around money, a feeling that no matter how hard you work, the good arrives late, or arrives thin, or does not arrive at all. And I want you to know that quietly ends today. So before we go any further, type the 2 words, God supplies, right into the comments below. Let it be your seal on what you are about to receive. The first key is this: your supply can never rise higher than your own concept of yourself. Not because God is withholding anything, but because consciousness is the very channel through which every good thing must travel. And if the channel is narrow, even a flood of blessing has to squeeze itself down into a trickle. Florence Scovel Shinn taught that people are constantly applying for a supply they secretly believe they do not deserve, and so they sabotage it quietly, long before it ever fully arrives. And this is not something that happens dramatically. It happens in the small, ordinary corners of a day. A person glances at a job posting that pays well and thinks, "That is not really for someone like me," and closes the tab before even applying. A person is offered a raise and immediately feels a flicker of guilt instead of gladness, as though the increase were somehow a mistake waiting to be corrected. And none of this is coincidence. It is self-concept quietly steering the wheel. I think of a woman who once inherited a modest sum of money, and within a single year it was gone, not because she was reckless, but because somewhere inside her, she had always whispered to herself, "I am not good with money." It slips through my fingers, and that quiet sentence, repeated across years, became the very shape her supply was forced to take. Meanwhile, I think of another woman, with far less starting out, who kept saying, "I am a good steward, I multiply everything I touch," and a small gift in her hands became a business, became a home, became real security for her children. And the difference between the two of them was never the amount they were given. It is not the size of the check that determines your future. It is the size of your self-concept that receives the check. And here is a third picture worth sitting with. 2 people walk into the very same store, standing in front of the very same shelf. One quietly thinks, "That is out of my range," and turns away before even checking the price. The other, holding no more money in her account that day, calmly thinks, "I will look into that when it is right for me," and walks on unbothered. And notice, the bank balance was identical, only the inner posture was different, and it is that posture, repeated daily, that eventually decides what each of them will be holding a year from now. So this week, notice the sentence you say about yourself around money. Notice if you say, "I am always short," "I am never quite enough," because that sentence is doing quiet construction work in the background of your life, whether you notice it or not. It is not the economy deciding your ceiling. It is not your family history deciding your ceiling. It is the private, unspoken sentence you keep agreeing with every single morning. And here is the gentle truth. You are not your bank statement. You are not your past mistakes with money. You are a child of an infinite supply. And the moment you begin to accept that in your own private thought, before anyone else confirms it, before the evidence even changes, you have already widened the channel. Let your first act today be this simple. Let it be the quiet decision to think of yourself the way God already thinks of you. Provided for, cared for, complete. And let that decision come before any circumstance agrees with it. Because consciousness always leads, and circumstance always follows, never the other way around. I am God's beloved, and I now accept my rightful supply. The second key is this. Your spoken word is not decoration on top of your life. It is a working tool. Florence Scovel Shinn taught that words are things, actual vibrations sent out into the substance of the universe, and that substance obediently begins to shape itself around whatever you have declared. So if the first key was about what you believe underneath, the second key is about what you say out loud. Because the two must agree before anything moves. And here is what makes this key so easy to miss. Most people believe their words are simply reporting on their life, describing what is already true, when in fact, the words are quietly building what becomes true next. Think about how many times a day the average person says the sentence, "I can't afford it," said lightly, almost as a joke, over coffee, over a dress in a shop window. And each time that sentence is spoken, it is not an observation about the bank account. It is a command sent to the unseen substance, telling it, "Do not bring this to me." And it obeys, faithfully, every time. Now think of a different kind of person, one who catches herself mid-sentence and instead says, "I am considering it," or "That is available to me," and watch how differently her life begins to arrange itself. Not because her income changed in that moment, but because the direction of her own words changed. Florence Scovel Shinn often reminded her students that the tongue is a small member, but it sets the course of a whole life, the way a small rudder turns a great ship. And a person can hold a fine consciousness all morning and talk it completely away by lunchtime through careless complaint. Let us walk through this in an ordinary household, because the pattern hides best in the most familiar rooms. A husband and wife sit down on a Sunday evening to look at their bills, and the husband sighs and says, "We will never get ahead of this." And the wife echoes him without thinking, "It does feel that way, doesn't it?" And neither notices they have just stood together and spoken a joint decree over their own household. Agreement multiplies a word's force. So two voices agreeing that they never get ahead are not describing a shared circumstance. They are jointly building one. Now picture that same couple choosing, quietly, to change the sentence, not with forced cheerfulness, simply pointed a different direction. We are steadily working this out. We always find a way, spoken plainly, even while the numbers on the page have not changed yet. And notice, the bills are identical, only the household's spoken atmosphere has shifted, and it is that atmosphere, repeated night after night, that decides what kind of year this becomes. It is not the bill itself that shapes a household's future. It is the sentence spoken over the bill that shapes it. Your words are not neutral air leaving your mouth. They are seeds, dropped continually into soil that never refuses a seed. The soil does not ask whether the seed is a good one. It simply grows whatever is planted. Which means a careless complaint muttered while doing the dishes is still a seed, and a hopeful word spoken while folding laundry is still a seed. And both are growing, whether you are watching them or not. Imagine a woman at the checkout counter, watching the total climb higher than she expected, and instead of sighing, she quietly says under her breath, "I always have more than enough," and something in the transaction begins to feel lighter, less like a loss and more like a passing through. And imagine that same woman, later that week, asked by a coworker how business has been, and instead of falling into the familiar script of slow season, tight month, barely getting by, she simply says, "Things are steadily improving." She is not lying. She is refusing to give her voice to the fear instead of to the truth she wants to see grow. Because every time you narrate your circumstances in the language of lack, you hand the unseen substance fresh instructions to keep building more lack. And every time you narrate them in the calm language of sufficiency, even before the facts have caught up, you hand that same substance new instructions to build something better. So this week, become a quiet listener to your own speech, and to the speech of the home you live in. Notice how often never or always slips in around money. And each time you catch one of those sentences, do not scold yourself. Simply pause and say instead, "My supply is unlimited." Because it is not the world that is limited, it is the sentence you keep repeating over it. That is the second key at work. Your word going before you and preparing the way, so that circumstances arrange themselves not around your fear, but around your declared expectation. My word goes before me and makes my way prosperous. The third key is this. Faith is not a hopeful feeling, it is a substance, Florence Scovel Shinn taught, echoing the ancient teaching that faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. And notice that word substance. It is not empty, it is not wishful, it is actual material, unseen but entirely real. And when you act from that kind of faith, you are not pretending, you are simply seeing further than your physical eyes can see. Faith does not create something out of nothing. It perceives what has already been prepared in the unseen and calls it gently into the seen. The way a gardener does not create the seed's life, but simply plants it in soil, where that life can finally show itself. And most people treat faith like a mood, rising on promising days and vanishing the moment a shadow crosses the window. But Florence Scovel Shinn taught that true faith behaves like a foundation, steady under the house whether the weather is calm or violent, and a foundation that only holds on sunny days was never a foundation at all. I think of a man who needed to pay a bill several days before any money was due to arrive, and instead of panicking, instead of calling everyone he knew to explain his shortage, he sat quietly and wrote out the check in faith, sealed the envelope, and thanked God, the way one thanks someone for a gift already received. And within that short window of days, an unexpected payment arrived, almost to the exact amount, and he would tell you plainly, it was not luck, it was faith acting as substance, moving ahead of the visible facts to prepare the way. It is not the visible bank balance that determines your next move. It is the invisible faith you plant today that becomes tomorrow's visible balance. And here is where so many people quietly go wrong. They say they have faith, but the moment the check does not arrive by Tuesday, they collapse back into fear, checking the mailbox twice an hour, rehearsing disaster at midnight. And Florence Scovel Shinn was clear that faith without endurance is not yet faith at all. It is only a hopeful mood folding under pressure. Real faith holds the line, even when the evidence has not shown up. Real faith thanks God in advance, the way you would thank a friend, the moment they told you help was already on the way. And notice the timing. The thanks comes first, not after, because faith that waits for proof before it gives thanks has already reversed the very order that makes it work. Think of a woman waiting on a decision that would change her whole month. The letter had not come yet, the phone had not rung yet, and every hour without an answer was an invitation to panic. But instead of refreshing her inbox every 10 minutes, She chose a quieter practice. Each time worry rose, she simply said, "It is already settled," and returned to her day, washing dishes, folding laundry, speaking gently to her children. And when the answer finally came, it came in her favor, and she told me later the waiting had taught her more than the answer itself. Faith held steady is stronger than faith that only shows up when things look promising. There is a quieter version of this same story too, a young mother counting out coins at a register, short by just a little, and instead of the old familiar shame rising in her chest, she breathes and says under her breath, "Supply meets me exactly where I stand," and a stranger behind her, without being asked, quietly covers the small difference and walks away before she can properly thank them. And she would tell you it was not coincidence. It was faith, already moving as substance before the moment even required it. Most people only believe once the evidence arrives, but true faith believes before the evidence arrives, and that ordering matters completely. Because believing first makes room for the evidence to follow, not the other way around. It is not the arriving proof that gives you permission to have faith. It is the faith that gives the proof permission to arrive. So this week, take one situation where you are waiting on supply, some bill, some answer, some door still closed, and instead of watching the mailbox with anxiety, instead of rehearsing every reason it might fall through, practice thanking God as though the answer already left the invisible and started moving toward you. Because it has. Speak to it quietly through your day, the way you would speak to a friend already on their way to meet you. Not begging them to come, simply glad they are coming. I now walk by faith. And faith supplies my every need. The fourth key is this, and it asks something of you that no amount of positive words alone can accomplish. It asks for a death. But let me be very clear about what kind of death this is, because the word can frighten people when they first hear it. This is not a death of your body, and it is not even a death of your true self. It is the death of a false self, an old rehearsed identity that has been quietly running your financial life for years. A self that believes in shortage, that believes in struggle, that believes good things happen to other people but not to you. And Florence Scovel Shinn taught that this old self must be allowed to dissolve, so that your true self, the self already made in the image of unlimited supply, you can finally step forward and live. First, consider what this old false self actually looks like in daily life. It is the version of you that grew up hearing money does not grow on trees, that grew up watching the adults around you flinch every time a bill arrived, that learned very early to associate money with anxiety instead of peace. This self was not born in you. It was handed to you, the way a coat is handed down from an older sibling. It never quite fit, but you wore it so long you began to think it was your own skin. And here is the tender truth. That inherited self was never the real you. It was a costume made of other people's fears. And Florence Scovel Shinn would remind you here, it is not your circumstances that are stubborn. It is the old self's grip on interpreting them that is stubborn. The very same empty mailbox can be read by the old self as proof that nothing ever comes, or read by the true self as simply a pause before the next good arrives. The mailbox never changes, only the self reading it does. Second, consider what happens when that false self is allowed to go unquestioned for years. I think of a man who grew up in a household where every conversation about money ended in tension. His father pacing the kitchen at night with the bills spread across the table. And even after this man became successful, even after his income multiplied many times over, he still felt a tight knot in his stomach every time he checked his account. His hands would hesitate over the banking app, bracing for bad news that was rarely ever there, because the frightened boy who believed there was never enough was still quietly running the show underneath his adult life, and no amount of income could satisfy an identity that had never agreed to feel safe. This is why so many people reach a level of outward success and still feel the same private panic they felt when they had nothing. The income changed, but the self-concept underneath it did not. And an old identity cannot receive what it does not believe belongs to it. It will find some way, consciously or not, to spend it away, to worry it away, before it can settle in and prove the old story wrong. And I think too of a woman who reached what most people would call comfort, a paid-off car, a steady position, some savings finally growing, and yet she still hesitated over small kindnesses to herself, a warm meal out, a modest gift for her own birthday, not because the money was not there, but because the old identity inside her had never been formally released. It kept insisting, this could disappear any moment, so guard it, hoard it, do not trust it, and that fearful guarding became its own quiet poverty. Even in the presence of plenty, because it is not the number in the account that determines whether a person feels rich, it is whether the self holding the account has ever been allowed to believe it deserves to rest. Third, consider how this death actually happens, gently, in practice. It does not happen through violence against yourself. It does not happen through shame. It happens the way mourning happens, quietly, and it begins the moment you stop defending the old identity, stop repeating its old sentences, stop introducing yourself as someone who has always struggled, and instead you let that old self simply fall silent, unfed, the way a fire goes out, not through being attacked, but through being starved of more fuel. You do not need to fight the old self. Fighting it only keeps your attention fixed upon it, and whatever you fix your attention upon, you feed. So instead you simply withdraw your belief from it, the way you might quietly stop returning a phone call from someone who no longer belongs in your life. Florence Scovel Shinn described this as putting off the old man and putting on the new, an old, tired, poverty-soaked identity, gently and finally laid down, so that the real self, whole and complete, made already in abundance, can rise up in its place. And notice, this is not a single dramatic funeral held once and finished. It is more like a series of small, quiet leave-takings, a sentence here retired, a habit there loosened, a flinch somewhere softened, each one a small death, and each one making room for a little more of the true self to breathe. Fourth, consider the reward waiting on the other side of this small death, because it is not small in feeling, but it is quick when you finally allow it. The reward is a life where you no longer perform confidence about money, you simply feel it, quietly, the way you feel the ground under your feet. I think of a woman who spent years introducing herself with the sentence, "I have always struggled financially." She said it at dinner parties. She said it to her own children, half joking, but never fully joking. And one day, almost without planning it, she simply stopped saying it. She let that sentence die, and in its place she began saying, "I come from a family that is learning abundance." And within months, not years, her circumstances began quietly rearranging themselves to match the new sentence. An old debt was forgiven unexpectedly. A client she had written off, finally paid in full. A door she had knocked on for a year suddenly opened. And none of it was magic. It was simply that the field of consciousness had finally been cleared of the old planting, and something new was allowed room to grow in soil, no longer choked with the old crop. It is not the dramatic prayer that changed her life. It is the quiet retiring of one old sentence that finally let the new crop through. Fifth, consider how gently this can be tested in your own week, without drama, without announcing it to anyone. Simply notice the small moments when the old self tries to speak on your behalf. The moment you reach for your wallet and your shoulders tense before you even see the total. The moment someone mentions an opportunity and your very first inward reaction is "that could never be for me." That reaction is not truth. It is only the old identity defending its territory, and you do not need to argue with it. You only need to notice it and let it pass through without agreeing. the way you would notice a stranger's opinion shouted from across a street, worth hearing, not worth obeying. And notice too how the old self loves company. It grows loudest exactly when you are around people still speaking its old language. So if a room full of complaint about money makes your own shoulders tighten, that is simply the old self recognizing kinship, and you are allowed, gently, to stop supplying it new company. Sixth, consider one more angle worth sitting with, because sometimes the old self does not announce itself through fear at all. Sometimes it announces itself through a strange discomfort, with too much good, arriving too quickly. A small windfall arrives. And instead of pure gladness, there is a flicker of unease, almost a need to give some of it away immediately, or spend it quickly, just to feel normal again, and that unease is simply the old identity, unused to abundance, trying to shrink the moment back down to a size it recognizes. This too can be noticed without judgment, simply named, that is the old coat again, and gently set down. Here is the exercise I want you to actually do this week. Pause for a moment right now, and pick one real sentence you have said about yourself and money for years. Something like, I always just get by, or money, and I do not get along. And once you have it clearly in mind, speak inwardly. That was never who I am. That was a borrowed coat, and I lay it down now, and let it go, quietly, without drama, the way you would set down a heavy bag you finally realized you never had to carry. Feel how much lighter the shoulders become the instant that bag is set down. That lightness is not imagination. It is the true self, breathing freely for what may be the first time in years. And if the old sentence tries to return tomorrow, as old habits often do, simply repeat the small leave-taking again, gently, without frustration, because every repetition weakens its hold a little further. This is not the death of you, it is the death of everything that was never you, and on the other side of it stands the self God always intended, provided for, at peace, free. The old fearful self dissolves now, and my true, abundant self stands free. The fifth key is this. Ease is a spiritual law, not a lucky exception. Florence Scovel Shinn taught that the way of the spirit is always the easy way, the frictionless way, and that struggle is actually a sign you have wandered off the path, not a sign you are working hard enough on it. So many people wear exhaustion like a badge of honor, believing that if the money did not come through great effort, it somehow does not count. But that quiet belief is exactly what keeps the door jammed shut. It is not more struggle that opens supply, it is more release that opens supply. And this is one of the gentlest truths Florence Scovel Shinn ever taught, because it asks you to stop mistaking tension for devotion. Think of a salesman who spent every evening long after his shop had closed, calling and recalling the same hesitant customer, convinced that if he only pushed a little harder, stayed a little later, wrung out one more phone call, the sale would finally close. And each night he went home more tired, more anxious, more certain that success required this kind of grinding, and yet the sale itself moved no closer at all, because his own gripping energy was pressing directly against the very thing he wanted to draw toward him. Meanwhile, another salesman, in that very same season, made his calls in the ordinary course of his day, and then in the evening simply let it rest, trusting that what belonged to him would come to him without being forced through sheer will. And it was this second man, not the first, whose sales quietly multiplied, not because he tried less, but because he stopped confusing tension with effort. Think of a door that only opens when you stop pushing against it, and instead, simply turn the handle. Gently, calmly, that is what releasing the grip of striving actually feels like in daily practice. Florence Scovel Shinn would say that anxiety is its own kind of prayer, a fervent, repeated prayer for the very thing you fear. And so the tighter you grip a situation, the more tightly you are actually praying fear into it, without ever meaning to. This is why so many hard-working people feel their good slipping further away the harder they clutch at it. It is not that effort is wrong. It is that clenched effort blocks the very channel it is trying to force open. This week, notice where you are white-knuckling a financial situation, checking the account too many times in a day, replaying the same worried conversation in your mind late at night, forcing outcomes that are not yet ready to move, and instead of gripping harder, practice loosening your hold just slightly, not abandoning wisdom, not abandoning honest action, simply releasing the tension that has quietly gathered underneath the action. It is not the size of your effort that determines your supply. It is the ease underneath your effort that determines how freely your supply is able to move toward you. I release the struggle, and let my good come easily. The sixth key is this: gratitude is not a polite afterthought once supply arrives. It is the very mechanism that multiplies it. Florence Scovel Shinn taught that praise and thanksgiving increase whatever they are directed toward. The way sunlight increases whatever it touches. And this is not sentiment, it is law. It is not more effort that multiplies your supply. It is more gratitude for the supply already given. And here is what makes this key so easy to miss. Most people believe gratitude is something you offer after the good arrives, a kind of polite thank you note, mailed off once the gift is already in hand. But Florence Scovel Shinn taught the opposite direction entirely. Gratitude is not the response to increase. Gratitude is the cause of increase. It is the very substance that goes ahead of the visible good and prepares more room for it to land. So it is not, I will be grateful once things improve. It is, things improve because I am grateful now. In the middle of what looks like too little, think of it the way a small seed is planted quietly in the dark soil, long before any basket of fruit is visible above the ground. Gratitude is that quiet planting, and increase is simply the fruit that was always going to follow once the seed was given room to grow. You do not dig the seed back up every hour to check if it worked. And you do not withhold gratitude simply because the harvest has not yet appeared above the surface. And to see this clearly, let us walk through a single, ordinary day, the way most people actually live it. In the morning, the alarm goes off, and the first thought is often a quiet complaint. Another day, another set of bills. By the time coffee is poured, the mind has already reviewed 3 worries about money before the day has even properly begun. At the office, or at the kitchen table working from home, there is a brief flash of comparison. Someone else's raise, someone else's new car, someone else's ease, and a small, ungrateful sigh escapes, barely noticed. At lunch, the wallet feels a little thin, and the thought arises. It is always like this. By mid-afternoon, a bill arrives by email, and the shoulders tighten instantly. By evening, dinner is eaten in front of a screen showing other people's vacations, and a tired voice inside says, "That will never be me," and the day ends, and the person goes to sleep having spent an entire day unconsciously training their own consciousness toward scarcity, hour by hour, without ever once directing a single grateful thought toward what they already have. Now imagine the very same day, lived by someone practicing the 6th key. The alarm goes off, and the first thought is, "Thank you for this new day and its provision." Coffee is poured with a quiet, "I have enough," at the desk. When comparison arises, it is met gently with, "I am grateful for my own unfolding good." At lunch, even a modest meal is met with real thanksgiving, not performed, felt. When the bill arrives by email, instead of tightening, there is a pause, and a whispered, "Thank you," that this is already provided for. In the evening, instead of comparing, there is a simple appreciation for the roof overhead, the food on the table. The day survived and even enjoyed, and that person goes to sleep having spent the very same 24 hours training their consciousness toward increase. And here is what Florence Scovel Shinn understood so clearly. The circumstances in both days may have been nearly identical: the same bills, the same modest income, the same comparisons available to notice. But one consciousness was multiplying scarcity all day long, and the other was multiplying supply all day long, and multiplication always compounds, which means these are not neutral equal choices, over weeks, over months. They produce two entirely different lives from what looked like the same starting conditions. It is not the bills themselves that decide which life grows from them. It is the thought laid quietly over the bills each time they are noticed. I think of a shopkeeper who kept a small ledger of complaints without ever calling it that. Every slow afternoon logged with a sigh. Every quiet week met with a private accounting of everything wrong. And business stayed exactly as thin as his attention made it, until one season he began a different ledger instead. 3 lines each night: the customer who smiled, the bill that somehow got covered, the quiet roof still over his head. Nothing dramatic, simply noticed and named. And within that same ordinary season, without any new advertisement, without any new strategy, the shop began to steady, then to grow, because he had stopped feeding the empty column and started feeding the full one. And increase always grows in the direction it is fed. And I think too of a mother who sat down with her children each night at dinner and asked them to name one small good thing from their day: a kind word, a warm meal, a ride that arrived on time. And she noticed, months later, that the family's whole atmosphere around money had softened. The tight jaw at bill time had eased. The quiet dread before opening an envelope had quietly lifted. Not because the income had dramatically changed, but because the household's attention had been retrained, night after night, toward what was already being supplied, rather than what still felt missing. It is not the size of the gift that determines whether it multiplies. It is the attention you give it afterward. A small check, thanked deeply, multiplies faster than a large check resented or worried over the moment it arrives. And this is worth repeating in another way. Gratitude does not wait for abundance to prove itself first. Gratitude is the very proof that convinces abundance it is welcome here. This week, try keeping a small gratitude tally, not a vague feeling, an actual short list each evening. 3 real things supplied that day, however small: a meal, a ride, a kind word, a bill somehow covered. And watch what begins to happen to the things you have not even written down yet. Because the universe, Florence Scovel Shinn taught, is exceedingly generous toward the consciousness that notices what it has already been given. My gratitude opens the door, and increase walks through it. The 7th key is the deepest one, so let us take our time here, because this is where everything you have gathered so far finally comes together into one working whole. First, consider what it actually means to assume a state. Florence Scovel Shinn taught that the fulfilled wish is a state of consciousness you can enter now, before the visible facts agree with you. And this is not pretending, it is not fantasy. It is a deliberate, quiet decision to feel from the place of already having received, rather than from the place of still waiting to receive. And the difference between those two inner postures is the entire difference between prayers that seem to work and prayers that seem to go unanswered. When you pray from lack, saying, "Please let this come," you are actually reinforcing the very lack you are praying against, because your dominant feeling in that moment is emptiness, and emptiness, spoken with feeling, is still a creative word. It still goes out and shapes the substance around you. But when you pray from fulfillment, thanking God as though the answer has already quietly arrived, even while the visible facts have not yet caught up, you are aligning your consciousness with the actual truth of the hidden plan we spoke of at the very beginning, the plan that answers before you call. Second, consider the ordinary example of the front door key. Florence Scovel Shinn often spoke of imagining a key had already been placed in your hand for the very thing you desired. Not a key you are hoping to be given, a key already resting in your palm. And she would ask her students to sit quietly and simply feel the weight of that key, the coolness of the metal, the certainty of possession, not gripping it anxiously, simply holding it the way you hold your own house key, without any tension at all, because you already know the door is yours. This is what it means to assume the feeling of the wish fulfilled, not gritting your teeth and forcing a feeling that is not there, simply relaxing into a truth that is already spiritually settled, even while it is not yet materially visible. Third, let us slow down further and walk through a single relatable story so you can see this key working in an ordinary life, rather than in the abstract. I think of a woman waiting to hear back about a position she had interviewed for, the kind of waiting that stretches long and quiet, where the phone stays silent for days, and most people in that waiting spend it rehearsing the rejection before it has even happened, checking their email every hour, feeling their stomach tighten a little more each time nothing appears. But this particular woman had learned the seventh key, so instead of spending her waiting hours rehearsing loss, she spent 5 quiet minutes each morning simply imagining the small, ordinary moment just after the offer came. She imagined herself opening the email, reading the words, "We are pleased to offer you the position," and she imagined the small physical gesture of exhaling, of quietly saying thank you out loud in her kitchen. She did not imagine parades or grand celebrations. She imagined the plain, undramatic aftermath, the coffee still warm on the counter, the quiet relief settling into her shoulders, and she returned to that small imagined scene every morning, gently, the way you might return to a favorite chair. And when the offer did arrive, she said the strangest part was not the offer itself, it was that she recognized the feeling. She had already been living inside it for days. The outer event simply caught up to a state she had already quietly taken residence in. Fourth, consider the danger that quietly undoes so much good work at this stage, and it is this: doubt spoken immediately afterward. I have watched people practice a beautiful affirmation in the morning, feel wonderful for a few minutes, truly touch the fulfilled state, and then spend the rest of the day undoing it sentence by sentence, saying to a friend at lunch, "Well, I don't know if it will actually happen," or lying awake at night, rehearsing every reason the good thing could fall through. And each of those sentences is a small counter-decree, spoken with real feeling, cancelling out the earlier one. It is not that the affirmation failed, it is that the doubt spoken afterward was simply the louder, more frequently repeated word, and the substance always obeys whichever word is repeated with the most conviction, not merely the first word spoken that day. Fifth, consider why so many people quietly resist this key, even after hearing it clearly. And it is because assuming the fulfilled state can feel, at first, almost like lying to yourself. The mind wants proof before it will relax. The mind wants the check in hand before it will feel calm about the check. But Florence Scovel Shinn taught the order runs the other way entirely. The feeling comes first. And the visible proof follows the feeling the way a shadow follows a body. You do not wait for the shadow to move before you take the step. The step comes first, and the shadow simply obeys it. In exactly the same way, the felt state of already having received is the step, and the visible circumstance is only the shadow that must, by law, eventually follow. Sixth, let us make this even more concrete with a second everyday picture, because a key this deep deserves more than one lens. Think of a mother waiting on a settlement check that had been delayed for months, letters back and forth, phone calls that led nowhere, the kind of waiting that wears a person thin. And every time she sat down to pay her own bills in the meantime, her hands would shake slightly. Not from anger, but from a private thought she kept repeating, "What if it never comes?" And notice, that sentence itself was the very opposite of the fulfilled state. It was living fully inside the unfulfilled one. So she made a small change, nothing dramatic. Before opening her bill folder each week, she paused for 30 seconds and pictured the exact moment the check would finally clear. The small, ordinary relief of watching the number update on her banking app, the quiet exhale, and she held that 30 seconds gently, the way you hold a warm cup rather than gripping it. And she told me later that those 30 seconds each week were the only thing that kept her whole household steady through months of delay. And when the check finally did arrive, she said it felt strangely familiar, like meeting someone she had already been introduced to somewhere else first. Seventh, consider the actual exercise. So pause for a moment and pick one real desire you are holding right now, something specific, an amount, a position, an opportunity. Hold it clearly in mind, and instead of asking for it one more time, simply imagine the moment just after it has already arrived. What would you be doing in that moment? What small, ordinary gesture would you be making? Perhaps signing a paper, perhaps hanging up the phone with a smile, perhaps depositing a check. Sit inside that small, ordinary gesture for a few quiet minutes, not the grand celebration, the small, quiet aftermath, because the aftermath is where the feeling of fulfillment lives most convincingly, and let yourself feel the calm, settled certainty of someone for whom this has simply already happened. This is the seventh key in practice. Eighth, consider how this connects back to everything already given. The self-concept from the first key determines what you believe you are allowed to receive. The spoken word from the second key directs the unseen substance toward or away from that receiving. The enduring faith from the third key holds the line, while the unseen becomes seen. The death of the old self from the fourth key clears out the old blockage, so the new state actually has somewhere clean to land. The ease from the fifth key keeps you from clenching the very thing you are trying to receive. The gratitude from the sixth key multiplies whatever has already begun to move. And this seventh key, the assumed fulfilled state, is the very hinge all the others turn on. It is the moment where belief stops being merely mental agreement and becomes lived, felt, embodied certainty. Ninth, consider that this key is really the living proof of the very verse we opened with. Before they call, I will answer, and while they are yet speaking, I will hear. Because when you assume the feeling of the wish fulfilled, you are simply agreeing, inside your own consciousness, that the answer has already been given. You are not begging a distant God to hurry up and notice you. You are quietly stepping into the answer that was, in truth, prepared before you ever asked. This is not arrogance. It is simply trust, taking its proper shape. 10th, consider how differently two people can wait for the very same outcome, one clock watching, one already at peace. Imagine two applicants for the very same loan. Both submitted the same paperwork on the same day. One spends the following week refreshing his email every hour, imagining rejection letters before they exist, rehearsing what he will say if the answer is no. And by the time an answer does arrive, he has already lived through the loss 100 times over in his own mind. The other simply pictures, once each morning, the quiet relief of driving away with the keys already in hand, and then returns to her day, unclenched. And though the paperwork was identical, though the numbers on both applications were nearly the same, it is the assumed state, not the application, that determined how each of them met the outcome, and often, in ways that cannot be measured on paper alone, it is the assumed state that quietens the very hesitations that stand between an answer and its arrival. 11th, consider one final caution and give it real weight. This state cannot be assumed once and then argued with for the rest of the day. It must be returned to, gently, repeatedly, the way you return to brushing your teeth, not because it failed the first time, but because maintenance is simply part of how consciousness holds a shape over time. A garden is not planted once and then abandoned. It is tended, watered, returned to daily, and the assumed state of already having received is tended the very same way, quietly, without anxiety, simply a gentle return, again and again, until the visible world has no choice but to rearrange itself around what your consciousness has already quietly settled into as true. I now live from the feeling of my wish already fulfilled. The eighth key is this. Once a word is spoken, once a state is assumed, it must be guarded. Florence Scovel Shinn taught that many people build a beautiful consciousness of supply in the morning and then spend it carelessly by evening, not through any dramatic failure, but through small, careless conversations. It is not enough to speak the word once. It is guarding that word against every voice of doubt that comes afterward. And this is the key almost no one tells you about. Because everyone loves the fresh morning decree, the flash of certainty, but very few are taught what to do in the long quiet hours after the word has already left your mouth. And it is precisely in those unguarded hours that so much good work quietly comes undone. I think of a man who prayed with real faith about a business opportunity, felt the fulfilled state clearly, and then made the mistake of describing his hopeful plan in detail to a relative who had never believed anything worked out for anyone, and that relative answered with a long list of everything that could go wrong, and within an hour, the man's clear inner certainty had curdled into anxious second-guessing, not because the plan itself changed, but because he had handed his freshly planted seed to someone with cold hands. Now consider a second story, quieter, closer to home. Two neighbors each received the same encouraging news the same week, a possible opening at work, an opportunity that could change their situation considerably. The first neighbor came home, sat with it quietly, thanked God under her breath, and simply told herself, "This is already working out," choosing, deliberately, to say very little about it to anyone, the way you might shield a small flame with your hand until it can stand in open air. The second neighbor came home and immediately called her sister, then a co-worker, then posted about it, inviting opinion after opinion, and by nightfall she had absorbed 6 different versions of doubt dressed up as concern, and by the time she went to sleep, her original certainty had been quietly diluted 6 times over. And here is the part worth sitting with. Both women received the very same opportunity, but only one of them woke the next morning, still standing fully inside her fulfilled state. And it is worth asking plainly, which neighbor have you been this year? The one who cups the flame, or the one who hands it around the room for everyone else to breathe on? Florence Scovel Shinn was firm about this. She taught her students to be quiet about their treasure while it is still forming, the way a photograph must stay in the dark until it is developed, or the exposure is ruined before the image ever has a chance to appear. And she would remind them gently that this has nothing to do with shame. It is not that your good is fragile because it is weak. It is fragile the way any new thing is fragile. A seedling, a wet painting, a wound just beginning to close, tender simply because it is young, not because it is untrue. And this does not mean secrecy out of fear, or isolating yourself from people who love you. It simply means learning the difference between sharing your joy with someone who can hold it gently and exposing a tender new state to someone who will press their thumb into it without meaning any harm. Most discouraging voices are not cruel, they are simply frightened themselves, and fear repeated near a new state is still fear. However kindly it is delivered, consider also that guarding the word is just as often about the private conversation you have with yourself at 2 in the morning, when the house is quiet and no one else is present to plant a doubt. And yet the doubt arrives anyway, dressed as practical thinking, dressed as being realistic, and you argue with yourself for 20 minutes about all the reasons it might not work. No outside voice was needed at all. You were both the flame and the wind in that moment. So guarding your word means guarding it even from your own tired mind late at night. The same gentle cupping of the hand applies, whether the wind comes from someone else's mouth or from your own worried thoughts circling in the dark. Pause for a moment now and think of one hope you are currently holding, and honestly ask yourself who you have been telling about it. and how you have felt in your body after each of those conversations, lighter or heavier, because your own body will tell you plainly which conversations guarded your flame and which ones let the wind in. Notice too how you feel after too long spent alone with your own worried rehearsal of it, because that counts as a conversation as well, even if the only listener was you. And once you can see that clearly, the correction is simple. When doubt arrives, whether from another person's mouth or from your own tired mind, do not argue with it point by point, the way you would in a debate, because arguing with doubt only feeds it more of your attention. It is not the loud rebuttal that protects the flame. It is the quiet withdrawal of attention from the wind altogether. So instead, simply say to yourself, "That is not true of me now," and gently return your attention to the fulfilled state you have already claimed. Not with tension, not with force, simply the way you would redirect a small child's attention back to something calm and good. Guarding your word is not paranoia, and it is not distrust of the people around you. It is simply treating your own consciousness the way you would treat a small flame in the wind, cupping your hand around it gently, patiently, until it has grown strong enough to stand in the open on its own. And every flame that has ever grown into a steady fire began exactly this way, sheltered quietly, faithfully, long before anyone else could see it burning. I guard my spoken word, and I let no doubt extinguish it. The ninth key is this, and it brings us back to the very heart of the title we began with, the word immediate. Because Florence Scovel Shinn taught that supply is not a future event. It is a present reality, simply waiting to become visible. And the moment you place your good off into someday, you unknowingly push the visible arrival off along with it. It is not that God delays. It is that our own language of someday keeps recreating the gap between now and the good we are seeking. First, consider how ordinary this habit is. I think of a man in his kitchen on a quiet Tuesday, paying a few bills, saying under his breath, "One day I will feel financially free," said lightly. The way people say it every day, as though someday were a kind and patient friend. But Florence Scovel Shinn would gently stop him and ask, "Do you see what you have done? You have filed your good under a date that never actually arrives, because someday is not a day on any calendar. It is a permanent postponement, wearing the disguise of a plan, and every time it is spoken with feeling, it renews itself, tomorrow, and the day after, second. Consider what it looks like to retire that word quietly. A woman I think of used to end every conversation about her finances with, "Someday I will get ahead." And one ordinary morning, brushing her teeth, she simply stopped mid-sentence and said instead, "My good is here now," and something in her shoulders loosened that had been tight for years. Not because her balance changed that instant, but because she had stopped feeding the gap. Third, consider that immediate supply rarely wears the costume we expect. Sometimes it comes as an idea rather than a check, or a door opening rather than money falling from the sky. And if you are only watching for one narrow form of good, you may walk past the very supply already standing in your doorway, waiting to be welcomed in. Fourth, consider the quiet arithmetic of one ordinary week, lived under the spell of someday. Monday it is. Someday this debt will be paid off. Wednesday it is. Someday I will feel calm about money. Friday it is. Someday there will be enough left over to breathe. And by Sunday night, 7 small decrees have gone out, each one saying, "Not now, not yet." And the substance, faithful as always, simply obeys the word it was given, so someday keeps arriving. A horizon that moves one step back every time you step toward it. Fifth, consider how different that same week becomes when now quietly replaces someday, Monday. My good is already moving toward the paying of this. Wednesday, I feel calm about money now. Friday, there is enough now, and more is already on its way. And notice, The outer facts may look nearly the same either way, but the consciousness beneath them has become an entirely different address for supply to be delivered to. It is not the facts of the week that change first. It is the word spoken over the week that changes first. And the facts, being obedient, follow quietly after. So this week, pause for a moment and notice any place you have filed your own good under someday, a raise you keep postponing in imagination, a peace you keep assuming will come later, and gently, without straining, move it into now. Let now be the only address your good ever needs. My good is here now, not someday, now. Here is the whole picture. It was never 9 separate lessons. It was one key, turning further with each teaching. Your self-concept decided what you could receive. Your spoken word decided what would move toward you. Your faith held steady while the unseen became seen. The death of the old fearful self cleared the ground so the true self could finally stand. Ease kept your hands open instead of clenched. Gratitude multiplied whatever had already begun to move. The fulfilled state gave every other key somewhere real to land. Guarding your word protected what had been planted, and recognizing your good as already here, now, closed the gap that someday had quietly kept open for years. It is not 9 different disciplines, it is one single turning of consciousness, away from lack and toward the truth that was already spoken over you before you ever called. If you want to keep turning this key daily, with guided decrees, deeper teaching, and a steady companion through this whole practice, I have built something called the Overflow Covenant. It is a gentle, structured path through everything Florence Scovel Shinn taught about supply, faith, and the spoken word. Available now for a simple one-time gift of $37, fully covered by a 30-day peace of mind guarantee. So there is truly nothing to lose in trying it. You will find the link in the description below, and I would be honored to walk this further with you there. Say it once more with me now. I am open and receptive to God's abundant supply. My good comes to me now and in expected ways. My word is my wand. And so, beloved, God's plan for you was never hidden because it was withheld. It was hidden only until your own consciousness was ready to see it. And now that you have seen it, your immediate success is simply the truth catching up to what has already been spoken.